Good afternoon. Welcome to this session on reviewing and improving quality in large-scale teacher education and development programs. The speakers for this afternoon are Sara Pierson and Duncan Wilson. Sara Pierson is Head of English for Education Systems with the British Council in London, and she's responsible for the English teacher development programs globally. And Duncan Wilson is Regional Director of English for Education Systems and coordinates the British Council's English public sector work across 11 countries in East Asia. I welcome them for this session, and we really look forward to an in-depth analysis on reviewing and improving quality in large-scale teacher education. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Okay, so Duncan and I are going to talk to you about a project quality assurance framework that we have developed for the British Council to review and assess how our teacher development programs are performing globally. But before we go into the detail of the framework itself, I thought it might help just to set a little bit of context about the British Council and its work globally. For those of you who were in the plenary session this morning with Alison Barrett, you will have heard about quite a lot of the activity that we're doing within India. And our project quality assurance framework is aimed to support all our projects globally. So we work at all stages in the teacher development process, from working in projects to support teacher educators within pre-service teacher development, but also often at the in-service stage and supporting ongoing CPD for both teacher educators and for teachers in a wide variety of contexts. Some of those contexts are quite resource rich. They have classrooms that have a lot of facilities and a lot of teaching aids that can support the teachers. But more often, we're working in very low resource environments to support teachers who do not have access to the latest ICTs or indeed to good textbooks or other kinds of resources to support their teaching practice. We engage with our teachers and with our teacher educators in a wide variety of different formats, different types of delivery. Often it's face-to-face workshops. Again, as Alison said this morning, we bring people together for periods of time to participate in a training event. They then go and enact and practice that activity within the classroom, and then we bring them together for a second workshop. But we also support teachers with technology-enabled projects. For example, in Uruguay, we have a very large-scale project supporting primary school teachers using remote support through video conferencing. So British Council trainers will beam in via video conferencing to support the teachers and actually to do some direct teaching alongside the classroom teacher in those environments. We work in cascade teacher development, so working with the teacher educator and then ensuring that the cascade happens effectively, putting in place monitoring, mentoring and support at different stages in the cascade to ensure that that happens appropriately. And we have some very large-scale mentoring schemes, and you'll hear a little bit more about one of those in Malaysia later on in the presentation. Not only do we provide training and development for teaching English, we also support other subject teachers who may be teaching computing or science or other subjects within the English language, and we find that that's an increasing trend across the different regions of the world within which we work, right the way through from primary through secondary and higher education. So how do we review quality given the complexity of this landscape and the scope and scale of the work that we're doing? we decided that we needed to think about a common framework that was going to work across the different types of projects that we worked, and to develop something that would work at the different stages of the project, the program development. And having looked at what was already out there, we couldn't find an existing framework that suited the needs for our projects. So that led us to develop the PQAF, the Project Quality Assurance Framework.
Sorry, it's not showing the slides first.
Oh, sorry.
Can we get the slides there? Oh, they didn't see that first slide.
Okay, right. So I showed you the first slide there, which I think I just talked to anyway. I don't think I need to go through it. So we spent some time working on the development of a project quality assurance framework to set out some minimum requirements for good practice at all stages of teacher development programs, and to develop the criteria that we felt would assist our staff, our trainers, in ensuring that their development programs were being effective. And the criteria have a very simple mechanism for assessing whether our performance on those teacher development programs is on track, whether it needs developing, whether there's a point of excellence there, or whether it's not applicable. And of course, we want to ensure that our framework celebrates success as well as identifying areas for improvement. So it aims to provide a health check on projects and provide us with a summary of progress and an assessment of risk, and ensure that we can intervene at an early enough stage to improve our practice and ensure the effectiveness of our teacher development work. The output from the process is an action plan. So we want to ensure that when we've done a PQAF exercise, when we've reviewed a project, that the team that the work doesn't stop there. So the team on the ground, the project team, is expected to produce an action plan explaining how they're going to respond to the findings of the review and ensure that any areas of weakness are addressed. And we have adapted that both from other British Council frameworks through our teaching centre network, but also trying to incorporate the best elements from external frameworks that we've come across. And in 2014, we have implemented our new framework in projects in Malaysia, India, Tanzania, and Burma. And actually, since then, we've also implemented it in Japan and on a smaller scale in Spain. And that's been very much a developmental process so that we can learn about what works in practice and how we can adapt the framework to suit a variety of different contexts. And we'll talk a little bit more about our experience in each of those locations later on in the presentation. This slide is just to give you a sense of what it looks like in practice. So this is from one of the sections within the Project Quality Assurance Framework. This particular section relates to project design and planning, monitoring and quality assurance, and you can just see there some of the criteria that relate to that aspect of the project. And perhaps I'll just give you a moment to read through a couple of those criteria. And as you'll see there, it's pretty comprehensive. It's dealing with a variety of different aspects of project design and planning, through from good governance and making sure that there's a structure in place to review the project and make sure it stays on track, through to quite detailed issues such as logistical matters and how accommodation is provided for trainers, etc. So why did we feel that we needed to put in place this framework? I think one of the main reasons, which I guess is fairly obvious, is about strengthening quality assurance at all stages of the project cycle, right the way through from early design through to delivery and implementation, and also importantly through to closure. I think it's often easy to overlook the requirements at the closure stage and what you do to sustain the impact of the teacher training intervention that you've provided. We want to standardise elements of our project design and delivery, whilst I explained earlier that we operate in a wide variety of contexts, I think one of the challenges there is how do we develop our best practice and how do we apply that from one location to the other? And of course the training and the support has to be context specific, but we also need models of best practice that we can apply, that we can learn from and that we can adapt into those different contexts. We will also want to ensure that we're learning from our previous experience, that we know that when we've done one teacher development project or teacher educator program within one part of India or any other workplace in the world, that we are drawing down from that experience. We're learning the lessons, we're identifying what's worked and what hasn't worked, and we're applying that and we're feeding that into new project design. And as I mentioned earlier, it's also about mitigating risks and ensuring that we're identifying problems at an early enough stage within a project to address those, to adapt our practice, and to ensure that that's reflected in the next phase of the teacher development programme. A very important aspect of what we are trying to do here relates to the final bullet point there, and that's that it should act as a tool for staff development. Because we have many different projects in very many different parts of the world, teams often operate slightly in isolation from each other. It's not easy to bring them together into one location to discuss their projects and to learn from each other. So we very much see this as a developmental tool for our staff to ensure that they can learn from each other, that they are developing their knowledge and their capability in teacher development and teacher education programs globally. So our approach to the PQAF, the Project Quality Assurance Framework, is to ensure that it's a developmental process. It's not intended as a policing exercise to audit our staff and make them feel that they are under too much scrutiny. It shouldn't be judgmental, it should be developmental, it should be supportive, and it should be constructive. And when we look at the challenges later on, we'll explore how that works in reality and what we can do to mitigate that sense within project teams that they're under the microscope. It should be mutual, it should be about two-way sharing. So this is about the reviewer going in and looking at what's happening on the ground in our teacher development projects, and they're sharing their expertise with the team on the ground, but it should be two-way. The reviewer will also learn things from their conversation, from their interaction with the project team on the ground. So it's about exchange. We want this to be a transparent process. We want it to be open and honest and to reflect the realities of operating on the ground in a variety of different locations. It shouldn't be about trying to put a gloss on the project. It should be about a mature identification of where some of the issues are in the project and what you can do to resolve those. We want to learn from mistakes. We want to ensure that those lessons are learnt and built into future projects. But I think importantly, this isn't about the monitoring and evaluation. The monitoring and evaluation is clearly a critical part of any teacher development program, and there will be an M&E plan that the team on the ground enacts, or indeed that they bring external reviewers in to undertake the monitoring and evaluation. So this isn't about duplicating that. This is about checking that the M&E is in place alongside the other aspects that we would expect of a teacher development project. Okay. Okay. So the process, we're going to start to get into the detail now of the review process before I hand over to Duncan. Critical aspect of this is that when we go out and do a PQAF review, that we meet with the key team members within the project team on the ground, and that means both the management team, the British Council staff that are involved in different aspects of the project, from the administration and support, the HR aspects, the finance team, through to the academic management of the programme and project management of the programme, so that we get a thorough understanding of all the different issues involved in the management of the project. But also, really importantly, that we talk to other stakeholders. So not only our own staff, but that we're out talking to the principals of the colleges, talking to the principals in the schools, that we're out talking to our partners where we're working with Ministry of Education, whether that's with a funding organisation like DFID or a partner in the delivery aspects of the project. It's really important for us to get a rounded understanding of the project from multiple different perspectives so that we can triangulate our own views. We found that we think it's really important that the team on the ground undertakes a self-evaluation of their work so that they are reflecting on their own practice, understanding where the strengths are, using the tool as an aid to reflect on where the strengths are and where the weaknesses are. And actually that's a really important part of the whole process, and will also help the review team together with the project team to identify the focus that we should place on different aspects of the PQAF exercise itself. There will inevitably be part of the process which is about documentation, it's about paperwork, it's about ensuring that the key documents are in place for the project, but that's not what it's all about. You know, one of the key aspects is around the interaction between the project team and the reviewers. So the documentation is important, but that's not the whole story by any means. It's about getting out there and going on site visits, going to schools, going to regions and seeing what's happening on the ground. And conducting with the trainers, with the teachers, with the teacher educators who are receiving the training, conducting some observations and focus groups so that we can understand what the realities are for them and the impact that the training has had on their own practice. And at the end of the process, then, we inevitably write a report and we share that with the management of the organisation and with the review team. But the important thing to say there is it should be an agreed outcome. It shouldn't come as a surprise to the project team at the end of the process. And actually, it's very important as part of the process that we are feeding back as reviewers and letting them know how we are, how things are going. So it's an agreed outcome. Okay.
Okay, so I'm just going to talk to you a bit more about some of the detail of what's in the different sections of the review, and then I'm going to tell you about some of the pilot reviews that we actually did and what we learnt from the different pilots. Because as Sarah said, this is a document that has evolved over quite a lot of time. It's been through a lot of iterations already, and I think will continue to evolve the more and more different types of projects that we use it for. As Sarah said, there are different criteria, the different standards, if you like, are each grouped into sections, different sections that are very broad sections that sort of relate roughly to the stages of project cycle. So you've got the pre-stage, the sort of around the design and the planning of the project. You've got a delivery stage, the during phase, which looks a bit more at logistics and what's actually happening while the project's underway. And then you have a final stage, which is a closure stage. That last stage would really only be looked at once a project's closed, obviously, clearly. They are very broad stages. In all projects, you would look at all of the different stages, but the focus might be different depending on the life cycle of that particular project. As I said, they're divided into different areas. We tried to group the criteria together in order to give some structure and meaning, and I'm going to show you what the different areas are in a second. The criteria, some are very broad. For example, it might say the project fits with the country strategy for English. And others are very specific. It might say, for example, that staff on the project have signed contracts. So there can be very different sort of range within each criteria. And therefore the numbers of criteria per se, you can't really add them together and give a score out of the number of criteria met, because each criteria is not equally weighted, if you like. And we haven't tried to do that. No? Some of the criteria are much more suitable for particular project types. So some of the criteria refer to stakeholders and to donors and to different kinds of partners. Some of them refer to different types of methodology or proficiency, whatever the focus of the project is. So not all of the criteria will apply to all projects, but the approach is that you would have not applicable if you needed to, and you can adapt the review as and when you need to according to the project. Let's just look at some of the sections. So in the first section, as I said, it's around initiation, planning and design. This would be particularly important, this section, when a project was just starting or had just started. The numbers next to the 4 areas there relate to the number of criteria within that section. And as I just said, whilst to some extent they give an indication of how important that section is to the overall review, because the criteria themselves are not weighted equally, you can't really do that. So the first section is around strategy. This is looking at whether the project is aligned to the country strategy for English, to the British Council's own strategy and other projects, and also to other stakeholders working in the same field. So have we looked at whether the project fits with the government strategy, with other donors, etc. Then one of the most important sections is around the objectives, outcomes and outputs. So does the project have clear objectives and outputs? Are the activities that are said to achieve those, are they appropriate? Do we have the right documents? Have we thought through a log frame? And have we started to design the M&E, the monitoring and evaluation, that will accurately measure the project? It's a very important stage of all of our project reviews so far. Similarly, that leads then into design and planning, which is linked obviously to the scope and objectives. And that is around whether the project is well designed, whether the resources and the inputs within it will achieve the objectives that are stated for the project, etc. So whether the governance structure of the project is appropriate and in place, whether some of the stakeholder relations, stakeholder management processes are in place and effective. And this will include quite a lot of emphasis on the M&E framework, on the tools for M&E, on the design of the M&E itself, and whether that's appropriate. And then finally, something around legal contractual. So just making sure that contracts are signed, that agreements are in place, that IP agreements are in place, etc., and that the legal environment has been considered. In the middle section, this is now looking at the way the project is being actually delivered and implemented. So project delivery and M&E, so is the project on track? Are things happening? Is it meeting its objectives already? Is it reaching the numbers of audience that it had stated it would do? Is everybody happy with it? Are things working? Is it going well? Is it being reviewed, etc.? Actual logistics, so things like are the venues suitable? Are the materials there on time? Are the accommodation arrangements for participants and trainers appropriate? Things like that. Then there's a whole section on staff, and this ranges from are the staff on the project appropriately qualified and experienced, to do they have contracts, are they contracted properly, to have they been inducted and recruited properly, and to their own CPD, so are they being developed and having appropriate professional development whilst on the project. Quite a big-ish section on finance, so looking at the project finances. It's not an audit, we don't do an audit, we just want to check that budgets are being monitored, that the right procedures are in place for some of the transactions on the finance, that reporting of finance is appropriate and timely. A section on communications. This would be both within the project, so internal communications within the project team, but also the PR, if you like, and the communications of that project and its achievements to the outside world, as well as to stakeholders and partners on the project. And finally, a section that is very specific to the British Council. We do have a raft of internal policies. We have an EOD policy, we have a child protection policy, a health and safety policy, we have a code of conduct, and we need to ensure that staff on the project are either appropriately aware of those policies and following those policies. So that's a sort of quick checklist. And then finally, as I said, the last section is related to project closure and handover. Looking a little bit, if the project's not already closed, at whether we are prepared for that stage and whether we have considered it and built it into project design, but more likely, once the project has closed, actually just checking off that things have happened. So we look at sustainability. How sustainable is the project in its design, and then is it sustainable? Is it being sustained? We look at whether the final evaluation and reporting has been completed and whether that's all sort of signed off or ready or underway and the right people have been informed about the outcomes and the end of the project. And we look at finance. We look at whether finance has closed, whether everything is finished and completed, and whether basically the project can be completely closed or has been completely closed. So those are the three sections. I'm going to tell you now a little bit about our experience of actually piloting the framework. The very first pilot was on the Malaysia upskilling project, the ProElt project. That's a very large-scale project, runs across the whole of Malaysia, reaching around 10,000 teachers. It's a proficiency project. We use a product called English for Teaching, but it's mainly aimed at developing the language levels of teachers. And we did the review of that project as it finished its first year, and it had just been renewed for a second year, and we went in at the very beginning of the second year. So it was already a very well-established project when we went in. And I think one of the lessons we learned there definitely was that it was actually perhaps a bit too late. There wasn't a great deal you could do or we could do to sort of influence and change, particularly things around project design and what was in it, because it had already started, it had already been agreed, it was already signed off with the Malaysian government. My colleague Annette, who's in the audience, was a big part of that review. The other thing we learned was that we were trying to do the review in way too much detail. We were looking at every single one of the criteria, trying to find the evidence. We were doing that thing where we were making the team prove to us that they had these things in place. There was not the right level of trust and understanding between the reviewer and the reviewees. We also had an enormous amount of preparation around paperwork, which we asked for. We asked to have a massive list of documents, which we subsequently found we didn't really need to look at. So we learned a lot from that review. We learned that we would maybe needed to be a bit more light touch. We learned that we needed to focus on the areas that the team themselves said we needed to focus on. And we learned to be a bit more trusting of one another in the review process, because as Sara said, it's definitely meant to be a developmental framework. It isn't an audit. It isn't us saying, well done, not good, done, good, good, good. It's like, what's good, what's not good, what can we improve, what can we develop. The second review was done by myself, and that was here in the Bihar, on the BLISS project in July. As you may or may not know, BLISS, I think, is the Bihar language in secondary students. Sorry, apologies, I did do the review, I can't remember what it stands for. We call it BLISS all the time internally. So I came over. It's a big project funded by DFID as well as the state government. It works with teacher educators in a cascade model aiming to reach 3,000 teachers across 38 districts of Bihar. It's mainly a methodology-focused project, and we came to India, we came to Calcutta, and then I went to Pune, and that was between BLISS 1 and BLISS 2, if you like. So it was as the first project had finished, or was rounding up, was finishing, and before a second phase, a renewal or extension of that had begun. And that was good. That meant that there was the opportunity to use the review and the findings of the review to inform phase 2. And I think that's one of the learnings, that really you want to do the project at a time when what you find can be implemented and can make a difference to the project. I think the other thing I learned from that review, as a reviewer, was the thing about it being very much a two-way thing. I'm based in Thailand. I work across East Asia. I know a lot about different projects in East Asia, but I don't know so much about projects in South Asia, particularly Cascade. I learned a lot from that project about Cascade training models and projects, and a lot of tools, a lot of excellent things on that project, which I've taken away with me since then and used. And also, I think, whilst during the review, particularly on the visit to Pune, the conversations between the reviewer and the staff on the project were very fruitful and very productive in terms of just talking about work, a lot of quality time together to talk about our different experiences in different places, our knowledge of other types of projects, what we know about this, what we know about that. A really good exchange of information. It was a great visit. I had a great time in Pune. I had some great food, of course, being India. Third one, Tanzania. This is a different type of experience for PQAF. Another DFID-funded project also with VSO as a partner and with the Ministry of Education. It's a pre-service teacher education program that has an English strand within a wider project across the secondary curriculum, and mostly working in this case with EMI, so English as a medium of instruction, so teachers teaching subjects through English, not necessarily English. It's a bit of proficiency and a lot of methodology, and it's working mainly in teacher training colleges as a pre-service program. The interesting thing about doing the PQAF here was that project had the previous year run into some problems, let's call difficulties really, around its design and its scope and its stated achievements. And it had been reviewed by DFID, and DFID had asked the British Council to make some changes to the project to improve it really. I think it was overstated, it was trying to do too much, and the resources and the activities within the project plan were not quite appropriate to achieving that. And so doing the PQAF was a useful experience because we were able to go in and see whether the council had been able to make those changes in the right way, whether the changes that had been made in the year previously had been effective and were improving the project. And they were, and it was good, and mostly it was good. There was quite a lot of improvement still to do, and I think the PQAF was quite a valuable exercise in identifying the areas for change and improvement. One of the other things we learnt there was that actually the team in Tanzania had delayed that PQAF review several times. We had originally wanted to go 6 months earlier and ended up going much later because they said they were too busy, they were too absorbed in delivering the project and redesigning the project. And actually the learning there was we should really have gone in when we said we wanted to go in at 6 months because we could have made some more important changes earlier in the project, or we could have identified areas of weakness earlier, and that would have been beneficial to the project. So one of the things we learned is that sometimes we as reviewers, or as the British Council's global or regional team, need to push our teams to allow us in to do the review at an appropriate time that is agreed between us, rather than allowing people to say we're too busy. Okay? And the last of the pilots was in Myanmar, in Burma, on a project called EFFECT. This is called English for Education College Trainers. It's another DFID-funded project, also in partnership with VSO and the Burmese Ministry of Education. This is a nationwide project. It's quite innovative for Burma. It's the first time the British Council's been able to work right across Burma. And we're in 35 teacher training colleges, working with teacher educators. A little bit like the Tanzania project, not quite the same. Not all of those educators are educating English teachers or even doing so in English. We actually work here with subject teacher educators teaching in Burmese or training in Burmese and training teachers of other subjects. We went in very early into that. Okay, sorry, I should also say it's a 2-year project where year 1 is proficiency, increasing language levels of the teacher educators, and year 2 is looking at teacher educator methodology. So it's still in year 1 now, that project. That one was very good. We were able to go in really quite early, just 6 months after the project had launched, which was a great time to go in because, as I said earlier, that does allow us to identify areas and to review the project early enough that changes can be made and implemented that can be beneficial to the project going forward. And one of the other interesting things we learned there was that the PQAF process was already working globally because we saw good evidence of learning on effect that had come from the Tanzania project and the Bliss project and had come really as a result of having done PQAF reviews there and then shared the findings of those PQAF reviews. The thing that came from Bliss, the whole M&E framework and some of the needs analysis tools came from Bliss, and they came because I'd seen them when I did a PQAF, and I was able to say to the team, while they were setting up EFFECT, that I thought they should use these tools and they should refer to us. So this whole thing about global exchange, sharing best practice, sharing knowledge, is definitely evidenced by that. Okay, so that's the end of the pilot. So we did 4 pilots. Throughout that, from each pilot, we changed the document quite significantly. We did an awful lot of trimming, removing things. There was a lot of duplication. Many of the criteria were quite repetitive, and or vague. Sometimes they said things like, okay, it's not a very good example, but things like, the project is effective. I mean, it's just meaningless. It has no meaning. So we had to reword some of the criteria, but we certainly had to remove a lot. And just again, looking at Annette in the audience, the document that we see today, she will see is very, very different from the document that we did on the first review. It's much simpler, it's much more straightforward, and it works very well. And I think by the time we got to Pilot 4, we were pretty much able to use the review we'd done in Pilot 3 because it's sort of ready, if you see what I mean. It will never be finished, and it will continue to evolve and iterate the more and more different types of projects that we use it on. Okay, thank you. Back to Sarah to do lessons learned.
Thanks, Duncan. So Duncan's touched there on some of the things that we learned as we went through the process, but some of the challenges, just to add to that with some of the challenges, I think one of the biggest challenges was how to get the balance right between keeping this relatively simple, relatively generic, applicable across the different contexts, but also comprehensive. So as Duncan said, we needed to reduce the documentation, we needed to reduce the framework down, make sure it had a coherent structure, but also reduce the burden on some of our teams on the ground in terms of needing to produce hard copy documentation. We felt the evidence was in the wrong place, and we needed to kind of trim that down, make sure that it was about evidencing the things that we needed to see, not about a kind of huge generation of paperwork. That we need to be conscious of the context that we're working in, and we need to our review teams to be adaptive, to think about, well, what's going to work from the toolkit, what isn't going to work, how do we use it as an enabler for the conversation, for the undertaking of the quality assurance review, without it being a straitjacket or an inhibitor. And we're also conscious of the time burden here, and I think this, Duncan mentioned that our Tanzania team had been a bit reluctant to undertake the PQAF, and I think it can be quite a burden from the project team. So we need to be very conscious of that as a review team and make sure that we're supporting them at the right stage and being mindful of the impact and the burden on them as a team who have to get on and do teacher education and teacher support. That's what they're there to do. So it's getting that balance right. Another aspect was around when to do the review. As Duncan mentioned, in the Tanzania case, it probably would have been better to do it early. So I think, again, the review team needs to sit down very closely with the project team and work it out, do some forward planning to make sure that we're going in at the right time. We can't underestimate the importance of planning and preparation in terms of making the PQAF effective. We're trying to do quite a comprehensive review in a very short space of time. So we need to identify quite early on what we need to see, who we need to meet, but also build time in for reflection. As a reviewer, you find that you have a lot of information chucked at you, and you actually need time to step back, to consider that, to think about what it means for the project, before you then go and have your next set of meetings with the project team or with other stakeholders. We needed to do some support for our teams on the ground to ensure that we all have a common interpretation of the standards, and again, that's really important at the preparation stage, so that we all know that we're on the same page in terms of what we're looking at. And so meetings and indeed self-evaluation are really critical at that preparatory stage. The burden of proof, I think one of the challenges, again, going back to the documentation, is that it shouldn't be just about the documents. We need our reviewers to have an inquisitive mind, to be following pathways, if you like, of investigation and delving deeper as they get into the quality review process. So again, it shouldn't be too tightly interpreted. And we want to avoid day before initiatives. We don't want our project teams to feel that they have to rush around trying to create documentation that doesn't exist just because they've got a PQAF team coming to visit them. So this isn't a tick box approach to quality. It is about the value of the process is in the conversation. It's in the interaction between the project team and the reviewers, and that's where we get the real benefits out of it. It's not about the paperwork. We need to see the evidence where that's appropriate, but without having to produce lots of documentation. It should be a kind of show me approach where teams need to see the evidence, that they can see it on the screen, that they're confident that the project team on the ground has good evidence in place. Mentioned the importance of self-evaluation. We need to ensure that our teams take a mature and honest look at their programs and identify where they've got their own weaknesses. And I think we also recognise that the reviewer role is really important. They need to be supportive of the project team, but they also need to have the confidence to delve deeper when they need to and to challenge the project team. It can't get too cosy. Trust is essential. Project teams need to be able to feel open and honest without fear of reprisal, and that can sometimes be quite challenging. And the importance of staff development. As we start to roll this out across other locations and encourage our teams to engage in PQAF, we're going to need to support them both at the project team end to understand what it's about, but also for reviewers so that they know how to go into a PQAF and to do it effectively. Duncan mentioned that we've already revised the document on a number of occasions, and I expect that we'll continue to do that. It's an iterative process. It's about learning from best practice, and we will continue to review and refine it as we implement it. So what are the next steps? Well, rolling out across the British Council and cascading that down through our different projects in different locations. We already have a handbook, but given that our tool has developed, we need to kind of revise that and make sure that we've got the documentation there in an easily accessible format for our teams. We want to disseminate the tool. We found that in our discussions with key stakeholders in various locations and with our partner organisations that they're really interested in the PQAF tool, and they'd quite like to use it and think about how they can implement it on their projects. And we're keen to disseminate that and think about its applicability to different types of education systems reform projects. We're going to build in an annual process around this, both so that we're planning and identifying which projects would really benefit from a PQAF, but also to ensure that we're looking at the trends across different projects and we're identifying areas of strength as well as areas of weakness that we can improve on across our portfolio of projects. And importantly, I think for us, we need to integrate the PQAF into the design process for our projects. It's a core, it will become a core tool for us, and therefore it's a strength if our teams use it as a kind of checklist, if you like, at the project initiation stage and build it into our proposal. For more information, if you'd like more information about the PQAF tool, we have a handout which will be available here at the front at the end of the discussion. So please do come down to the front and get a copy of the handout, which will give you some more information. But also, if we've run out or if you want to find out more, there's an email address there that you can use to contact us and find out more. Okay, I think that's the end of our presentation. If anybody's got any questions, please feel free to put your hand up and we'll try and get to you. Any questions? Rod?
Of quality framework. Sorry. Do you have any plans to extend this kind of quality framework, this kind of tool to impact evaluation? In other words, post-project? Because the real proof of quality and success in a project is often only visible after the project has finished.
I think that's a very good point. I think that would be a different tool for a different purpose. This is very much embedded in the project design and implementation, and I guess the immediate outcomes from a project rather than looking at the longer term and the impact, the sustained impact from the project. Of course, we do that for a number of our projects, but I think you're right that actually leaving things for a period of time and then coming back and reflecting whether the impact that we thought our projects were going to have in terms of long-term change within an education system is an area that I think we would like to do more of, and we would like to strengthen, and I think we've just done one in Sri Lanka fairly recently. So, yeah. Any more questions? John.
If you already explained this, sorry, and I missed it right at the beginning. The point of excellence, then, what function does that have in your when would you give that, and why do you give it? And do you think the project teams that you review, they've kind of got that at the back of their mind and they're striving for a point of excellence? how it works?
The point of excellence is when we've deemed that something, and it's often it's a particularly strong example of something that we think can be taken into other projects. That's really what it's for. So identifying points of excellence is about finding key things that we think are best practice that can be used on other projects. There is a little bit of that thing of trying to collect lots of points of excellence, but remember, you can get a point of excellence for my contract was signed just as much as you can get a point of excellence for the project is clearly well designed and meeting its impact targets. So they're not really meaningful in that sense. I don't know if you know, colleagues from the British Council will know the TQS and EQS systems that we had, which evaluate our teaching centres and exams operations, and they are different. They definitely do count all the numbers of METs and not METs and divide to give you a sort of score. We don't do that on PQAF at all, and so we don't really count the points of excellence. It's not done like that.
I think the other challenge there is around what happens if they don't get many points of excellence and they need, the project as a whole is considered to need further development. And that's quite a challenge then in terms of how do you maintain the motivation and provide the support for that team to build the project up and ensure it gets onto a stronger footing without them feeling that this has been a negative process. So it's quite an interesting political challenge, I think, in terms of getting the messaging right around the PQAF and its outcome. And of course, honesty has to be the ultimate aim. Any other questions? Here?
The British Council is interested in teaching English all over the world. But, for example, in such countries which are still, at the beginning of teaching English, for example, in Yemen, why not to support such poor countries to develop, to do many projects regarding teaching English in such countries? This is my point. Just a kind of suggestion to do projects in such poor or developed countries.
Well, of course, we do a lot of projects in very poor countries or countries which have got a fragile environment. We're working in Afghanistan, we're working in many locations where they have challenges in terms of supporting the teaching of English and indeed teacher development in those countries. I guess as with any organisation, we are somewhat constrained with resources and also sometimes constrained with security, but we do our best to support the development of English in a range of different contexts, including some which are quite challenging.
I think it's also true to say that in the majority of our projects we work as a partner with government, so we tend to be working in countries where the government is doing something active in the development of English teaching, or wants to, or has some kind of strategy or plan. So if that's not happening in some countries, like, I know, for example, Cambodia, where there is no national blueprint for education reform, we can't really work there because it's not for us to necessarily propose projects. We want to work with partners who are already in the field. So it may be the case in Yemen, I think, that there isn't language teaching reform going on in the country. Any more questions?
Okay, well, thank you very much, and please do come down to the front and pick up a handout if you'd like to. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sara and Duncan, for providing us a very detailed overview of the project quality assurance framework, and more importantly, for sharing with us your experience of piloting this framework in different countries and in different contexts. And I'm sure the lessons that you learned in the process of piloting would be very useful for all of us who want to adopt or adapt this framework in our own teacher education context. Thank you very much. And as a small token of appreciation, we would like to give you some souvenirs at this point.